Good afternoon, everybody. I have a really loud voice, excuse me. I'm trying to wake everyone up. I know you just ate. Well, at BioForward, we're very pleased today to have one of our initiatives present a panel. It's the Women in Biohealth Initiative, which is connecting and supporting women in the biohealth industry. Our speakers today for this fireside chat is Binnu Palta Hill from UW System. We have Anna Hooker from Exact Sciences and Virginia Amann from,
Entente.
Entente. I know it's a French word, but enjoy. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, hey, I am delighted to be here, and it's great to see women as well as some men in the audience. So welcome. I'm Virginia Amann, CEO and founder of Entente. We're a strategic communications consultancy based here in Madison, but focused on healthcare and global health internationally. And I'm very passionate about this issue of women inclusion in the workforce. Have the great privilege to work with World Economic Forum on this issue. And I just recently am developing a campaign with PBS NewsHour to help sort of retell the stories of women around the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave us the right to vote. So more on that later, because I want your help on that. I've got some good news, and I have some bad news. The good news is, as of about 10 years ago, women are now 50% of the workforce overall. Bad news is we're only 20% of leadership positions overall. So things kind of get worse as you go up in the organization. Women largely stuck in middle management roles still. At S&P 500 companies in the US, only 7% of those roles are filled by women. Boards, a little bit better. We were about 18%. It sounds like in biohealth, according to Laura Strong, we're only about 10% of women on boards. So, so we've got a long way to go, which is why I'm delighted to be here with Anna and with Binnu to talk about this issue and hear from them some strategies that they can share with us on how to advance our own careers, how to develop allyship within the workforce with men, but also with women. Both Anna and Binnu are extraordinary women leaders in their own right, but they're also champions of women and workforce inclusion, which is great. So if you could each share a little bit about why you're passionate on this issue, I think that would be a great way to kick us off.
Sure. Well, one would think, we often hear the term we're in a post, you'll all laugh, racial or post-gender America. But it's actually quite the opposite. There are studies that are being repeated that were done 20 years ago where we're getting the same results. So for example, if there's a famous study done by a researcher at University of Chicago that was recently repeated where you replace, you have identical resumes and the only difference is that you're replacing a female name with a male name. How much more likely is the man able to get the position than the woman? What do you think?
Very likely.
Only 62% of the women will get the position where 100% of the men will. And that disparity exists when you introduce people of color, foreign-sounding names versus domestic-sounding names, any dimension. So our human instincts have remained the same, and then which are sort of further aggravated by a divisive climate globally that we live in. So the reason I feel passionate is I think there's a lot of loss of productivity, from a business standpoint. So globally, only 32% of the global workforce is fully engaged. Think about the loss of productivity. And a lot of that has to do with whether people feel like they're valued, whether they have a sense of belonging, they feel like they can come to work and perform at their sort of the optimal levels. And there's a lot of neuroscience research that shows if we don't feel a sense of belonging, if we don't feel valued, and there's no equity or fairness in the workplace, we will not perform at our best. In fact, we will be spending a lot more time looking for affirmation than actually solving the problem at hand. So as an educator, I find it intriguing. When I teach in our MBA program and I look at these students and they On the surface, consciously, we all believe in inclusive leadership. We believe in equity. However, our behaviors can be quite contrary to that. And so I find that there's a lot of science that we can utilize to examine why do we behave the way we do? Why does our behavior not always align with our conscious beliefs when it comes to equity? So I'll stop there and let Anna.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this conversation is fascinating because I honestly don't believe that we are where we need to be. I don't really mind which industry you work for and how much we say we're inclusive. It's really how we act and what we do to really show that inclusivity. And that's really the key to see whether we're advancing is what are the true results of our words? What are the true results of our policies? It's not just hiring token to say we have a woman in the blah suite, or we have a woman in the blah level, or we have a black person or a brown person or an Indian. It doesn't matter, right? It's really, we need to look at what does it mean to truly put in practice these things we say we do, right? So I feel very passionate about it because I'm lucky enough to be in a situation where I am in an executive position at a company for whatever that means. It could mean very many different things to different people. What it means to me is that I have an opportunity to express my opinion to those that have the ability to change what we do. And that means that I can be loud or passive or strong or more quiet. I can choose that, but I can use my voice for those that don't have that opportunity to be there and that wish they had that opportunity to be there. So I can be an ambassador to many, not just women, not just color or accents or not accents, but just change the conversation and be able to have that inquisitive nature put at the table and be able to ask questions and be able to even just create some thought process and thought-provoking moments on my peers at that table. And whether they agree or not, whether behaviors change or not, at least the conversation or I planted that seed that maybe at night when they're dreaming may come up. Or maybe when they're tossing and turning when something happened, it may come up. And maybe that conversation comes something bigger. And if we all that have that power to be at that situation, use that voice and use that moment, that opportunity to create that conversation, we will at one point make some change. But if we don't have the courage to do it, we will not change it because people are going to gravitate to what they're comfortable. The term boys will be boys, it's not just boys will be boys because they like boy things or they do things. It's because you do what you're comfortable with. Girls will be girls. It's human, right? Humans will be human with what they're comfortable. So if you don't start changing that conversation in some shape or form, nothing is going to really evolve and those statistics will remain or decrease.
And with the, I'm sorry.
Go, no,
To
yeah.
add to what Anna said, the whole idea of, that unless we examine the behaviors and unless we look at, what are the sort of male norms of behavior or women, how are women expected to behave, for organizations that are most innovative, there's a lot of evidence that in those organizations that those roles are being challenged constantly. So it's that growth mindset rather than a stagnant mindset. So if we are having a conversation, because a lot of this is really coming down to conflict management, negotiation skills. It's very similar to that. It's just that we're talking about gender or we're talking about race. But if we look at it much more from a growth mindset and how do we evolve, how do we innovate, it's required that we call out certain behaviors and that we take a more active approach in redefining our social norms.
So let's take a step back and talk. I think we're here to talk in part about allyship as a strategy for making the change that you are talking about. What does that really mean? What does allyship mean? What is a male ally? Does it go beyond a man who holds a belief that greater inclusion in the workforce is important? What are we really talking about here?
Well, I will just rock it and I will say I don't believe that allies need to be men. I don't believe that women need men to be allies, and I think that that's the voice. If you repeat it enough, you believe it. I think that men need allies the same way women need allies. I think the gender needs to be separated from this whole conversation. This is not about gender. This is about a business purpose, a priority in your industry, on the organization you work, and how do you get to where you need to get, and how do you have that conversation in prioritization, in getting whatever the priority is to move forward. And whether it's a man that is presenting at the table or it's a woman, it doesn't matter. If you're a male and you work at a certain level of an organization and you have an agenda that you need to move forward, and you need to find that voice at the table, your ally can be another man, your ally can be a woman, your ally can be two women, two men. It could be whatever. It doesn't have to have a gender. Allies are gender neutral in my mind, right? We call them men because traditionally, men are the people that have the seat at the table. And if they want to know who is this mousy little person in the corner that is doing all the work and creating all the things that happen, and they can come and say, look how great it is. That's very traditional. That's very old. That doesn't necessarily is the way that the world truly works. There are a lot of very strong allies that come in every color and every flavor of gender that you want to see.
I think that's a great point. Binnu, yeah, I think you have
I'll offer a slightly different perspective. Anna and I were talking at lunch about this, and I love that idea. And unfortunately, in my experience, I haven't encountered it. So ideally, I would like it to be where we are allies and we are helping each other more in the sense of moving the business forward or moving a particular business objective forward. But I find that because human nature and because of socialization, part of it is evolutionary, it's just neuroscience, some of it is sociology, that we don't see people as just people. We are seeing our first thing that we notice about people is their exterior, and gender is a huge component of our identity. And we're socialized to attribute certain characteristics, whether it's to women, to people of color, or to men. And so if you think about diversity in the sense, so the idea of diversity complicates the situation. And when I say diversity, what I mean is any characteristic, think about this, any characteristic that influences the way we are perceived and the way we're treated. And that is, that's very compelling when we're talking about allyship or whether I have equal share of power. So if we could be at the same level, all three of us, but the fact that we are very different in our ethnicities is going to play a role in the distribution of power. Unless we're cognizant of it and we're deliberately attributing power in certain ways. So ideally, I would love that, but I find, unfortunately, we are not even close. And so we have to acknowledge the reality and face it where we're at. And in that case, to me, an ally is man or a woman, but oftentimes, depending on the context, right? If it's a male-dominated environment and male voices seem to be more heard more often, then I would enlist a male ally. Yeah. And then oftentimes I'll say, hey, I'm going to need you to step in and do this. It doesn't mean I am somehow putting myself down. I'm just meeting the circumstances and making the situation in a way where I can be most effective.
Yeah, I think your point on perception is really interesting. So there was a recent survey that was done, I think 2017 academic study, in which the majority of men who were surveyed suggested that the number one reason that women were not moving up into leadership roles is because they don't speak up often enough or loudly enough. Is it true do you believe that that's true? Is it a perception? And you just mentioned some great strategies for addressing that. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. And I know, Anna, you had some ideas on that as well.
Can you go? Oh, all right. I don't want to dominate the conversation. Tell me the first part of the question.
Is it true? Is it true that women do not speak up as much, or is that a perception issue?
I think that's a perception issue. I think the fundamental, in my own experience and with those colleagues I'm close to who have shared it, it really has a lot to do with the ability, having sponsorship. So somebody who's willing to spend some personal political capital to help you advance. That means they're not just giving you advice in person, but they're actually rooting for you behind closed doors when you're not there to leadership. That has a huge impact on career progression. And for women, because traditionally, we haven't had those networks. So we don't have that grooming or the sponsorship all along. We lose out. And actually, women aren't the only ones. Any marginalized member of population loses out. People of color do that. If I'm a token in an organization, I'm not going to have somebody who kind of really relates to me, because one of the fundamental things we have is an affinity bias. We like people like us. They don't challenge us, they get us, we feel good, we feel comfortable when we're around them, so we're more likely to speak up for them. If we don't relate to someone, we're much less likely to speak up. There are really kind of interesting studies actually that have been done in this area where, this is a kind of a gross one, but it's interesting nevertheless. Participants were shown videos of people being poked in the face with a needle. And so the participants were separated by ethnicity. And although the physical reaction was the same, it evoked this cringing feeling when you watched it. The brain activity, the level of empathy one felt, it was much greater when it was someone that you related to than if it wasn't.
Interesting. So how do you ask for sponsorship? How do you approach somebody should you approach somebody who's more like you, somebody who's different than you? How do you ask for sponsorship and support? What are some strategies for that? And also, how do you make a sponsor relationship successful? And by the way, I think we're defining sponsorship and mentorship a little bit differently. Mentorship and giving advice, sponsorship and not only giving advice, but also connecting you into networks and championing you into leadership roles. So how do you ask for that? How do you ask for that kind of support?
I'm not sure that you necessarily go and ask all the time, because it depends what you're dealing with. I would love to find a sponsor that looks like me or speaks like me. Guess what? I won't, right? Where I am, I won't. Unfortunately, it's what it is, right? So for me, when I think about a sponsor, I think of a colleague that has a shared interest in moving that priority forward or that business initiative. And I will talk with that person and I will discuss the situation and explain the point that myself or someone in my team is bringing up. We'll discuss it and I will say, now for this to go forward, I'm going to make sure that we have a certain amount of consensus at the table and that we can bring points that will resonate with the audience at the table, which is really what you're trying to do. You're not trying to push an agenda just because it is your point and you will not be heard otherwise. You're trying to push something that you want it to be heard for what it is, for what it means to the organization, and to be heard by the right parties that are going to make the decisions. So you pretty much enlist that person to voice their opinion on why it makes sense or why it's a good idea, and maybe sometimes calibrate you. You may have a different approach after you speak to that person that is a potential sponsor or another voice at the table. They may have a different way of presenting this to what you're thinking, right? And it's sometimes that conversation of how do we put this in front of somebody else to give us an opinion.
So I view sponsorship and mentorship where a mentor can be an experienced person at any level, and a sponsor is a senior leader. So they have a lot more power than you. That's a big difference between mentor and sponsor. And sponsor will use that power, or they're willing to use that influence for you. And a mentor, they're more of a guide. They're more of a someone who can help you guide you navigate your career. And you want to carefully select your sponsor, because I have found, so to me, I haven't looked at necessarily what has influenced is not necessarily what the person's identity is, but more about their mindset. Are they able to understand what my daily experience, lived experience is? So, for example, I have a colleague who is, he's much higher than I am in multiple levels. So he's a tenured faculty member who is in senior leadership, and he happens to be quite conservative, who's a heterosexual white male, quite different from a lot of the dimensions of diversity I bring. What I like about him is that I can sit down and have a very open conversation. And I said, you know, the reason I think so-and-so behaved that way is because I'm an Indian woman. And although he has no clue, he's not able to relate to it personally, he's able to empathize. And he's able to do perspective taking. And when you find someone like that, grab onto them, because they usually become lifelong sort of career partners. And one thing I learned that I wish I knew in my 20s and 30s and early 40s, that it's okay to ask for sponsorship. You know, I used to wait till somebody's going to acknowledge me, because if you work hard, I mean, I have immigrant parents, so I was constantly told, if you work hard, your work will be recognized, and so don't worry about it. Well, that's not quite true. And I think we can ask for not only the sponsorship, but also ask for kind of that power in the moment that we were discussing, that Anna was referring to, that, you know, how do you move a project forward? So if I know the dynamics going into a meeting, and I know I'm going to be talked over, there's a particular person in the meeting, whatever the situation is, I may ask, I often do, I'll ask our dean, I'm going to need you to step in and do that. You set it up for me. And actually, it's really funny, because I used to feel very awkward and sort of like I'm belittling myself. I don't. I find that it actually builds trust, because it's exhibiting vulnerability. And when we exhibit vulnerability, we evoke empathy. And so it allows you to build a very much stronger connection. That's how I see it. I'll let you talk.
No, I'm thinking through that statement, because if I'm in a situation where somebody's speaking louder than me in a meeting, I think that's bloody rude, actually. I'm not going to go and say, oh, would you mind telling Johnny to please shut up so I can speak rubbish?
Right.
Right? It's like, I'm sorry.
So that's not what I'm saying you should do.
But I think it depends your situation, right? Because in academia, I agree with you, different forum, different power struggles in terms of power levels. And I think in academia, probably that's the right route. Mm-hmm. I think in the world that I live, for example, I think being polite and being respectful is enough, and perhaps even a pause and a silence until they recognize that maybe they're being the loud voice, and call it out, and they will notice, and it will self-correct. Mm-hmm. At least I'm lucky enough in my organization that I don't have the belligerent asshole at the tables that I sit, right? Which is what often happens in organizations, right? I mean, we are very lucky. I am very lucky, and I'm very grateful of the team that I work with that are, you know, we disagree politely, we disagree sometimes not that politely, but we still respect each other highly, and it's a great working environment in that sense. But you just really you cannot put up with it. You just have to do it politely and respectfully, but in my world. Mm-hmm. Now in your world, probably if I do that, I won't last 10 seconds, right?
Well, actually, so I speak more from a perspective of not just in academia, what I do, but also what I actually teach business leaders. So I do a lot of consulting for business leaders and how do you cultivate inclusion in your organization. And I recommend that approach to them. So when I say don't speak up for yourself, I don't mean of course you're going to be a self-advocate. What I'm saying is when you're in situations where you're at the only one of whatever identity you're representing, you are at risk of always being that person. And the thing is, you can be alienated very quickly. No, I mean,
get it.
What I'm talking about is over time, if there is a real cost, a political cost to being that person who always, oh great, there she goes again.
You know, when we met last month about this panel, I knew it was going to be a good one. I was like, these two ladies are passionate. I love it.
No, and I totally understand what Anna is saying, and I agree. I mean, there's no way I would ever advocate for someone not speaking for themselves and being demure. But all I'm saying is we have to be cognizant of the reality of the norms that are set. The word abrasive is used 47% more for the exact same behavior for women than for men.
Absolutely. I'm passionate and whining and right. Hysterical. I mean, all sorts of things are used, right?
Right.
And I understand the point. I just think the biggest mistake sometimes is to succumb to norms, because that's why we don't change. The more you succumb to a norm and the more it's okay, right, and you need to do X or Y, the more we're saying it's okay. Go back to boys will be boys, girls. Why don't we start saying girls will be girls when somebody becomes hysterical? Girls will be girls. You know, they're just making their point. That's not acceptable, right? We won't be able to say that. So we slowly have to work on changing that conversation rather than just fitting into that little box that you're constantly trying to be stuck in.
So I think if we, in order to change those norms, I agree 100%, we have to change those social norms. In order to change those, we have to enlist the people who are the most powerful in terms of the org chart, but also informally, socially, who have the most political capital. If they are not on board, we can kind of, at the end of the day, we'll hit our head against the wall and then be disappointed. I just find it's really difficult to you can be a change agent, but you have to have the buy-in from the people holding the power, formal and informal.
Yeah, I can see that.
I want to come back to more thinking from you, because it's actually very inspiring to hear somebody just tell it like it. It's great.
I'm going to take her to work with.
Right? So you know, as you're approaching these people with power, influencers within the organization or within your sphere, what's the incentive to them? How do you create an incentive? Is there an incentive, particularly for men, to support women? What is your thought on that?
I absolutely think that there's an incentive for men to support women, because, again, it's not a gender. It's who owns the deliverable at that point that is going to help you be successful as an institution. If it's a woman, if it's whoever it is, if you're a man and you need to support that, it will be supported because they have the same idea of pushing that forward, right? Or getting that done.
So you're talking about alignment against
Absolutely.
an objective.
And taking an initiative, that being a sponsor of somebody and taking that forward, supporting that. If it's a woman, I think, yes, absolutely.
So if you're seeking that support, it's important to show to whomever you're seeking that support from, that there is an alignment in what it is that you're trying to achieve and what they're trying to achieve, and that you can help them in a way get to where they want to go. Binnu, do you agree? What is your thought on this?
So I actually, Virginia was really kind and kind of sent us some points to think about. And as I was thinking about this last night, I remembered that there's actually, there's so much data we can use. For example, there's a McKinsey study that shows that a full potential scenario where women and men are performing at kind of optimal levels, given that there's equity in the workplace, it is $28 trillion would be added to the annual GDP. I don't know what better case there is than the business case. And as far as the business case, I mean, organizations where there's greater equity, I don't mean just that you have 50% women, but where are they situated? Are they throughout the organization? Are their voices actually heard, or are they tokenized? They outperform their homogeneous counterparts always. And they are much more agile. They tend to weather economic disasters better. They tend to outperform, their stocks outperform. So there's no better incentive. I mean, hopefully one wants equity for everyone, right? Most of us are fair-minded people. But if you really need a case, I mean, there's nothing stronger than that.
So I'm getting the signal to open it up for Q&A. And I think the opinions that have already been shared here are very inspiring. I know you all have questions. So who wants to open it up? Not a single question? Okay, maybe in the front?
So for context, I'm a graduate student. I think that matters because it adds another level. But you guys talked about kind of these small conversations that then go on to make hopefully big changes. But how do you first step out and make those small comments or change those conversations when an incident happens, especially if you're somebody that's a lower level, like a graduate student or things like that? How do you first make that step?
You know, that's a really good question, and I think that, like you said, it for us first entry-level career, I think that you start by creating a relationship with your management team that you work with, and creating that trust, and starting having those conversations in a productive exchange, and just a mind sharing, brain dump, non-threatening, just creating that trust. Because whether it's a man or a woman, doesn't matter, take gender away, right? Because there's a lot of, as much as there's a lot of women that are advocates for women, there's a lot of men that are advocate for women, there's a lot of men that are advocate for men. So taking gender away, I think having that trust and people know what you bring to the table and that you're a balanced, intelligent individual that is bringing good points for discussion, they start thinking about it as, let me bring this person in and ask for their opinion. Let me get this, whatever. And then you can start asking for, hey, this is something that I'm watching, that I have a concern. How do you recommend that we have this conversation, brother? Who do you recommend I talk to? Who can you introduce me to in the organization that I can have these conversations with? And you start building your network. And you start getting that, and then you become that informal leader around that people seek and want to talk about when there's these conversations.
So I would approach that similarly. The only addition, comment I would add is that, equip yourself with vocabulary that is sort of safe. There are a lot of words that have been politicized, so they carry a heavier meaning than what you might mean. So be cognizant of the words you use, because oftentimes we can point out the same thing with a different word. And then secondly, have a partner in learning. Find somebody that you really trust. I have a colleague I really trust. A lot of times we joke about, that women can be self-deprecating, because otherwise we're at the risk of, we're sort of socialized to think, don't take all the credit. Like, hey, good job, Binnu. And then, like, no, it was teamwork, this and that. She'll slip me a note like, be quiet, take the credit. You need someone who can give you very honest feedback. I mean, feedback truly is a gift if you can learn to give it and receive it. So that's the only addition I have. But I agree, networks, those are really powerful.
Very well said. One more? I see a question here.
And in the back.
How do you engage someone to get that feedback? So how do you ask for it if you're not receiving it from your direct leaders? If you kind of are getting stagnant?
So I would do it, this just happened. So I don't think there's anybody from our school here, but we have a new dean. And the first conversation I always have with a new boss is I said to him, so I actually had feedback for him in this regard. I said, I've been very fortunate to have supervisors and leaders who have been very transparent. And I've always enjoyed a very good relationship with them in terms of being mentors, like a reverse mentoring. Because there are certain things that, you're going to know that your boss doesn't. And so I said, if I have your permission, I'd like us to have a relationship like that. And so when he said, of course, then I said, well, I have some feedback for you. So, and that is how you get started. And then, or you tell them sincerely that, look, I don't take feedback. I don't see it as criticism. I want to grow. That's what excites me. I mean, convey your passion for continuous learning and for getting better. People are flattered by that. I think they would jump at the chance. And in fact, they're quite kind in giving the feedback. And they're less critical too then, because it's like someone has poured out their heart to you. You're not going to, empathy is evoked. You're not going to crush it. Right?
Thank you so much. Did you have more to add?
No, I agree with you. I think the one thing to remember is that everybody has lives and priorities and busy things that are going on, and just because they're not engaging with you about your growth or your feedback or things like that, it may just not be front of mind because there's 100 other priorities. So don't take it personal. Just ask the question and say, hey, just approach it, because it's a two-way street, and you often live in your own, and I'm talking for myself. Sometimes I'm in my own world, and if I can think of how many times I could have started my conversation differently, and I want a list of those words, because I don't think about what are those words, it will be better, right? So that's what I will do.
Well, thank you both. I learned a tremendous amount. I'm sure this audience did too. I thank you both for sharing your opinions and your ideas and your personal stories with us.